Isabella, welcome to Real Vision.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. I've been reading your work in FT Alphaville since at least the global financial crisis. So it is a great pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Like I said, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak to people who admire and like Alphaville.
Yeah. So we're going to talk today about CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. We were talking a little bit off camera. I was saying that I think about this maybe in three different layers, particularly with regards to your own work. The first is the very simple question. What is the current state of play in central bank digital currencies? The second is the broader and more expansive view, which is what's the right role, if any, for central bank digital currencies in the post-global financial crisis world, in an age of unconventional monetary policy, when central banks seem to be losing control. And the third is, what is money and why is it so damned difficult to understand?
So all the big questions. And obviously, I don't have the answers necessarily. As a journalist, my job is to ask questions and scrutinize and sort of ask alternative, questions, in the sense that I want people to think about things in a non-consensus way sometimes. The state of play of CBDCs is very interesting at the moment. There are two camps, I think. There's, maybe even three camps. There's the sort of experimental camp, which on the surface, every sort of G7 central bank is in that camp, I would say. That on the surface of things, they're sort of looking and researching how these things can be deployed, what advantages they bring, and superficially they've made no concrete decision one way or another. But I think in terms of what we hear from the central bankers, they're definitely inching towards a CBDC, and it seems like they like the control and the power that it might give a central bank in terms of tackling some of the sort of modern day issues, whether that's negative interest rates or money laundering regulations, etc., or just fighting off the threat from cryptocurrencies. So they're having a bit of an existential crisis, and CBDCs are very tempting because some of the controls that they can re-bestow on central banks, I would say. But at the same time, I think there is another camp within the central bank community who also acknowledges that there are, it's not just upsides. Central bank digital currencies pose really important existential questions in terms of the openness and competition of banks, and whether you can coexist in a market where the central bank dominates the payment system, and where banks can also operate in a way that is competitive. And I think that camp is perhaps being under listened to at the moment. And that's certainly at the moment where I sit. I think that's the more important argument that's not being heard. And then the third camp is sort of from the innovation fintech space and the cryptocurrency sphere, who just sort of see any move towards digitization as a step forward, I would say, without necessarily thinking about these unintended consequences. So that's how I would sum up the situation as it is now. And within that, there's China, which is sort of coming in and is either being utilized by the private sector as a reason why we have to go down the route of DM or Libra or whatever, or crypto, blah, 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 because if we don't, China will dominate with its yuan, or it's being used by central banks as a reason to step in and accelerate their own CBDC experiments. And whether that's a useful comparative or not, I think is up for debate personally. But there are different standards in China, and I think just because China is doing something, it's not a foregone conclusion that it will necessarily win the sort of reserve currency game. But also whether or not we want to emulate China itself is another question.
Yeah. Well, that very eloquently answers the first question, which brings me to the second. Give us a sense of the context of the backdrop for where we are today in terms of the global financial system. I know you've written extensively about the scarcity of safe assets, of good quality collateral during the global financial crisis. Here we are. We find ourselves over a decade into unconventional monetary policy. What's the basic backdrop for where we find ourselves today, and how is it relevant to central bank digital currency debates?
So I think QE was supposed to be, it was supposed to be like the original lockdown. It was supposed to be a sort of temporary measure that was only going to buy us time until we kind of got back on track and sorted out the global financial crisis. And then it sort of ended up being this sort of eternal it became chronic in the sense that QE, to this day, we haven't unwound the QE that we put into the system. And it set a precedent that is now really hard to reverse. And then now I think the pandemic has obviously moved the entire focus of the response to any kind of economic malaise away from, or financial panic, away from the kind of monetary side and over to the fiscal side. So now we see this huge sort of onslaught of fiscal spending by governments all around the world. And we didn't have much choice, I would say. I think it was sort of, brought upon us. If we hadn't have acted, the consequences would have been awful. But it does create it creates a precarious situation now in terms of how the system evolves from here on. And I think there is no doubt in my mind that there are inflationary forces creeping about. And what I like to say is, when inflation can be decades in the making, and then it just takes like a few weeks sometimes, or even months, for the mindset to entirely change. These things can really, if you look at sort of inflations from history, they do, unlike a sort of deflation, which is a slow, well, no, not necessarily, because deflations obviously also follow panics, but I think people kind of anticipate inflation as a long run thing, when actually the forces that bring it about can be long run, but it can actually turn on a dime very quickly. And whether it's the conversation now is whether it's transitory or not. But a really good point was made. I can't remember now who made it. Sorry if I steal your point. It's that whatever happens, the inflation is unlikely. The inflation that we're going to have in the short term, with the labor shortages we're seeing, with the resource prices going up, and with a lot of core goods going up, shrinkflation and all that sort of stuff, it's unlikely to be unwound. So it might settle down, but there has been a real loss of purchasing power in the dollar, in the pound, in the euro. And that's not going to go away, because it's very, very unusual for wages to go down. It's much more commonplace for them to go up. So getting people to agree to a wage cut is really, really hard, much harder than going the other way. And since we have sort of opened the genie bottle in terms of these bonuses to get, short-term, well, not short-term, just getting labor back into the sort of non-essential business sector, I think that's gonna be staying around for a while. And so I do worry that maybe inflation is out there. I know people disagree, and that it's a very sort of contentious debate at the moment. But I certainly think there is something out there. And the furlough, and then meanwhile, you've got this conversation about whether furlough has sort of justified universal basic income, and whether that's a mechanism we should be going into. And all these things together definitely speak of a paradigm shift. And I think it's not a coincidence that CBDCs are also popping around at this time. And the thing about CBDCs is obviously that they are a representation potentially of what I would call kind of programmable money, where terms and conditions can be applied to how you spend your money, not just in the history of the world, money has tended to be neutral. So whoever you are, even if your money's not good here because you've made a nuisance of yourself in some establishment, wherever you go generally, like a dollar is a dollar. Nobody discriminates against you because, in the history of time, a dollar was a dollar. But now we have like identity is now part and parcel of what the new regime is going to be about. And certainly that's the thing that's happening with CBDCs, is that identity is being embedded into the concept of money. And with that, certain terms and conditions with respect to who you are in society. And that is a new phenomenon that I don't think we've really seen in the history of the world, apart from a few. I can talk about it a little bit later, but there are maybe a few examples where something like this was around, but not to the extent that we have now on the horizon, I think.
Hey, if you like this clip, be sure to check out the full interview and more only on realvision.com/crypto. It's 100% free. Sign up now.